Good evening. Welcome. Welcome, everyone, to Yeshivat Hadar. We are so honored to be here tonight for the Jerome L. Stern Memorial Lecture. This is a special part of our Pre-Pesah preparation here at Hadar every year. It's amazing to be here back in the yeshiva space in person with people and also with the over 500 people who are registered online. This is really a major moment in the calendar for Jews in general, and it's always special to capture it in this moment. I want to just say a brief word to introduce a little of what's happening this evening. We'll be doing some learning, then there'll be some singing. There will be Mariv later for those who are interested at the end of the program. So keep that in mind for the flow. And I'm going to just say a word to introduce Jeffrey, who so graciously enables us to host this in honor of your dad every year. And what I will say is, I just said this to someone downstairs, Jeffrey is a true yeshiva bacher. Jeffrey really loves Torah, but more importantly, I have, since I first met you, experienced firsthand how you don't just love the content of Torah, you love the way in which there's a give and take around it in the Beit Midrash, in a live setting with other Jews. And so that makes it so special to share this moment with you. So thank you for your leadership more broadly in terms of Torah in the world, but also what you've given to Hadar in terms of your leadership over the past years is more than we can have words to appreciate. So I will hand it over to you to say some words about your dad and get us on our way.
Thank you so much. I am a yeshiva bacher, and Hadar is my yeshiva, which is a powerful statement because it's the only place that that we can learn Torah at the most rigorous, highest level, but also not to have any filters, to really, it's fully egalitarian, shivyoni, it's immersive, it's everything that I would ever have wanted for my yeshiva, and I'm glad that I'm alive at an age and a day that we have such a yeshiva. And it's amazing that now that the last few years are behind us, that we're here in person, because what Hadar is immersive learning. It's engaged learning. And how can you do that if you're not with each other? But we've taken something from the last few years, and that is that there's a whole Zoom audience. So it's really a hybrid, and it's open to so many other people. In the last year, my wife Orna and I went to a Shabbaton, which was amazing in and of itself, but obviously through the last years that we've been so far apart, really I think Hadar is stronger than it's ever been. Its message is more important than it's ever been, and it's wonderful to be here. You know, the subject matter of the lecture is what kind of a person can bring about redemption? How do we recognize them in our own lives? Tonight we celebrate my dad, and I think he had many amazing characteristics, but I think the biggest one was he was an amazing judge of character. And that worked for him in business, it worked for him in the arts. He found young artists. There's a young artist from Kenya that now has a one-person show at the new museum. But what I'd like to talk about today is the Moses that he found. He took us with my mom, who's here, and my brother Michael, who's here. He took us to Russia in 1974 under the auspices of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. And we had a list of the refuseniks that we could talk to. And this little guy comes up with a bag and a cockamamie story about how his wife, he married 3 days ago and now is in Israel. What's your name? Didn't find the name on the list. And my father looked at him and he said, "You can't make this stuff up. This must be a Moses." And it was Anatoly Sharansky. And they had a lifelong relationship. And that's why Passover is so important. We always had the matzah of hope. My father was a believer in hope in the future and discovering people and institutions like Hadar. I think he'd be very proud of our family's support of Hadar to bring the redemption one step at a time. I'm so pleased that today today, for the lecture, we have Michael Rosenberg, who again is the next generation of Hadar. That's the future, and that's what you see in Hadar, and I've been involved for a few years. To judge an institution is to judge what they produce, and it's the students more than the Rabbis, and it's the rabbis who are leading into the future. Michael has smicha from the Rabbanut in Israel, as well as from Elisha and Kolovich. He has a PhD in Talmud and Rabbinics from the Jewish Theological Seminary. We're touching a lot of bases here, which is so wonderful about him. He's the Associate Professor of Rabbinics at Hebrew College. And I just want to say that it's going to be amazing to hear him, and then we're going to hear some songs and some music. And at the Shabbaton, I discovered really that aspect of Hadar. And I have to say that there wasn't a meal, there wasn't a Seder, that at some point my father would say, let's have a song. He understood the power of song and music and our culture. So this evening is all about a celebration of him and a celebration of Hadar. And I welcome you all and thank you all for being here.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for those beautiful words of introduction, which could not be more appropriate. Before I begin, a couple logistical things. First of all, for those of you who are watching online, you are able to submit questions as they occur to you through the Zoom, and they will be taken at the end. We'll have some time for question and answers at the end. Question and answers appropriate for Pesach. And for those of you, first of all, everyone should have a source sheet in front of you, hopefully. And just to know, the first source there, the one which is not numbered, are the words to a melody we're going to be singing at the end of the question and answer period as we transition into the singing. So when we go into the learning, you'll start with source number 1, and you can just skip over that first unnumbered source. I was recently struck by a story I heard on the podcast Heretic in the House. The podcast tells nuanced narratives of people's experiences leaving the Haredi world, an antidote to some of the more sensationalized stories that have recently appeared in popular outlets. In one episode, the show's host, Professor Naomi Seidman, interviews a guest who, like her, had left the community in which she had grown up. The guest talks about an experience she had at work when a coworker, knowing her background, starts talking to her about the Netflix show Unorthodox. Thinking that her friend would sympathize, the coworker said something to the effect of, well, if I'd been part of that community, I definitely would have left also. You surely did the right thing. To which the formerly Haredi guest responded, gently but firmly, well, the vast majority of people in that world don't leave. So statistically speaking, no. You probably wouldn't have left. The episode gets across how tempting it is for us to imagine ourselves as the courageous heroes of our own stories, bravely doing what needs to be done. It lays bare how easy it is for incredibly difficult choices to seem obvious to others in retrospect. But in fact, we know that most people do accept the basic contours of the life they've been born into, whether out of genuine happiness or inertia or fear. The real question is not why people stay in situations that, to an outsider's eye, seem intolerable. The real question is why, and more important, how, does anyone break out of those situations? The title of tonight's lecture is, Would You Have Risen Up? And I'll return to that question later. But in some sense, the real question I want to ask is, what does it take to be the kind of person who can rise up? Who can hear Pharaoh's call to kill half of all newborns and say, no, we will not stand for this? Who can see the immorality of human enslavement and stand up, refusing to accept a reality that, by virtue of having been true for so long, seems inevitable? Who sees the ills of society around them and cries out that this is the path to destruction? What's the specific kind of strength that is needed, not only to envision a better future, but also to work and advocate for it? I want to think through these questions through the lens of several midrashim, all of which appear in the same 4-page or so stretch of Tractate Sota of the Babylonian Talmud. Between pages 11b and 13a of Sota, the Talmud explores and builds on the stories of the first 2 chapters of Exodus, and is especially interested in Miriam's role in bringing redemption. These midrashim all implicitly deal with a specific manifestation of the question I'm asking tonight. In light of a government decree that all baby boys born to Israelites must be thrown into the Nile, why would any Jews continue having children? What kind of person has the courage, or maybe recklessness, to decide to continue procreating in the face of a brutal decree, making clear that this choice will lead to suffering and death? The Talmud's answers to these questions are inspiring, but also challenging. I'd like to explore them with you and consider their significance for us and this moment tonight. We're going to start with a set of 2 texts that expand on the Torah's appellation for Miriam, Miriam HaNeviah, Miriam the prophet. The first source number 1, discusses the 2 midwives, Shifra and Puah, whom the Torah describes in Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 to 21. In the biblical text, Paro tells these midwives to kill any male children born to Israelite mothers, leaving female offspring to live. But Shifra and Puah, the Torah tells us, feared God, and therefore refused the order from Pharaoh. These 2 women, about whom we know nothing other than what we see in these 7 verses, you don't have the verses in front of you, only the midrash, these 2 women display exactly the kind of willingness to stand up that we're trying to understand tonight. Why? Why did they stand up to Pharaoh? All we are told is that it was because they feared God. When the Talmud tells this tale, it engages in the classic midrashic move of associating lesser-known characters with better-known ones. So the 2 midwives, Puah and Shifra, become, in one version, Miriam and her mother Yocheved, respectively. But if Puah and Shifra are really Miriam and Yocheved, why, the Talmud reasonably asks, did the Torah call Miriam Puah? The answer is Shaisa Puah Umotziah Esavlad, because she would blow gently while delivering the child. Now, commentators disagree about what exactly blowing gently does in this context, but irrespective of what we precisely define that to mean, it seems to me that its significance is that it was indeed a gentle act. Gentleness. That's an important trait. And it's actually a surprising one in this context, because the practice of midwifery is intense physical work, demanding significant bodily strength. Lesson number 1, then, is that to be the kind of people who can bring redemption, we must be at one and the same time both gentle and strong. The Midrash offers an alternative explanation for Miriam's being called Puah. Devar acher, another interpretation. Shaisa poa baruch hakodesh. She would cry out in the spirit of divine prophecy. Ve'omeres, and she would say, Asida imi sheteled ben shemoshia es Yisrael. My mother is destined to deliver a child who will deliver the Jewish people. Miriam's divine message is further explicated in source number 2. Why, in source number 2, the Talmud's voice asks, when the Torah refers to her as Miriam the prophet, does it call her Aaron's sister, but not Moshe's? The verse is, Vaytikach Miriam HaNeviah achos Aaron, the sister of Aaron, and it doesn't mention Moshe. The 3rd century sage Rav answers, because her prophecy, as we know already from source number 1, predated the time when she was a sister to Moshe. That is, she prophesied before Moshe's birth. The continuation of the story, its fuller context, tells us more about the boldness of Miriam's prophecy. Why would Amram and Yocheved even consider having another child, given the likelihood that that child's life would immediately be placed at risk. Why? Because their daughter prophesied that the child Yocheved would bear would redeem the Jewish people. And at first it seemed like she was right. When Moshe was born, we're told, the house filled with light, portending great things from the newborn. In thankful joy, her father kisses her on her head. But when they can no longer hide the child, and desperation drives them to a choice no parent can, and no parent should ever have to imagine making, and they place a 3-month-old child in a basket in the river, they no longer have faith in her prophecy. In lieu of a loving parental kiss on the head, her father, or in the better manuscripts of the story, her mother, now gives her a patch, a strike on the head, sneering, "My daughter, where's your prophecy now?" This is the fate of the prophet: to be derided, to be mocked, to be told to shut up. When, in the 8th century BCE, Amos lodged his barbs at Israel, his most cutting criticism was that the Israelites shut up the prophets. Amos writes, you don't have the source in front of you. Amos writes, they hate the one who reproves in the gate, and they abhor the one who speaks the truth. Eventually, Amos was accused of treason by agents of the state. And though the text does not tell us what became of him, most scholars assume that he was executed. Such is the fate of the prophet who hopes to avert communal destruction. Miriam's fate teaches something even harder to hear, something I only noticed when I taught this text recently at Columbia Barnard Hillel. Julia Lang, a first-year student there at Columbia Barnard, pointed out to me that unlike Amos and so many of the biblical prophets, Miriam's message is not one of destruction, but of hope. Yet even so, even though she's not prophesying doom, she's prophesying redemption, even so, she becomes an object of derision. Because the path to redemption is not linear, because it is so often a journey of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. When we find ourselves in one of those reversions, the pain can be too much to bear. And just like those who were chastised by Amos, we want to silence the prophet. I find myself thinking here of the work of contemporary climate activists who have to thread an incredibly fine needle. On the one hand, the situation is dire, and they are called to tell us that. And when they do, many of us instinctively recoil. We want to shut up our ears, and perhaps even to shut them up. Can't you just let it go for one day? I might say to a friend who raises the environmental impact of a choice made when we're supposed to just be having a fun day. On the other hand, those same climate activists need to tell us about the possibility of hope. A possibility, but not a guarantee. Perhaps, if we turn things around today, we can avert the worst of the prophecy. What will we say to our modern day prophets when, even if we succeed in making the changes we need to, things don't improve, or don't improve enough, or don't improve quickly enough? Will we repay their communal service with derisive calls to be quiet? This was Miriam's fate. And perhaps understandably, the negative response of her parents causes her to doubt herself. This is why, according to the Midrash, she goes to watch baby Moshe from afar to see what would become of her prophecy. Miriam's faith is not unshakable. She's no longer sure that her prophecy will come true. She needs to see what will become of it. She needs to know whether this moment in Moshe's life, while awful, painful, and unimaginable, is only a bump in the road, or is a sign that her prophecy was an illusion. At the same time, even when things seem darkest, Miriam does follow the infant. That is to say, her faith is shaken, but it is not broken. And because of that, she may be the only one who truly knows that though the path to the Exodus is full of twists and turns, she and the Jewish people remain on it. And that's lesson number 2, that to be the kind of person who can shepherd in redemption, we are not called upon to be Pollyannish dreamers, so inured to the suffering of the now that we never question our own hopes and beliefs. We are called upon not to give up hope. Doubt and hope can and must coexist. And this is, in some sense, another manifestation of that first meaning of Pua, the midwife who gently blows as the child enters the world. Miriam the prophet, who follows her baby brother to see what will become of her prophecy, is a woman both gentle and strong, firm and understanding. The next set of sources, sources 3 and 4, focus on a different aspect of Miriam's role in bringing redemption. Not Miriam as prophet, but Miriam as sage. As in the first sources, the rabbis are bothered by the question of how parents could even consider trying to conceive in a time of such immediate calamity. And in source number 3, the dilemma is explicit. Amram decides that the danger of fathering a son who would be subject to immediate execution is too great a risk. He divorces Yocheved, and as a leader of the people, his action inspires all of the other Israelite men to do the same. Along comes Rabbi Miriam, making a classic rabbinic argument, a kal v'chomer, an argument from a weaker case to a stronger case. Your decree, she declares, is worse than that of Pharaoh. Pharaoh, Miriam says, has sentenced Jewish boys to death, but you've declared an end to all the Jewish people. Pharaoh's oppression destroys the body, but your capitulation destroys the soul. And perhaps most damningly, Pharaoh's evil may come to pass, but your misguided attempt to avert evil will surely become manifest. Convinced by his daughter's reasoning, Amram remarries Yocheved, and the other Israelite men follow suit. Now, in many ways, the scene is the same as the previous source. Miriam convinces her parents to maintain hope, to continue with life in the most dramatic way possible, by continuing to conceive and bear children. The differences are important, though. In source number 2, Miriam first tells her parents of the divine message she's received, and it is not a challenge to something they've said or done. She simply relates the oracle, and we, the readers, understand what inspired Yocheved and Amram to continue on. Here, though, Miriam's logical argument stands in the face of her father's choice. It's not an implicit criticism, but rather an explicit attack on someone she is supposed to respect as an authority figure, her father. Not only that, this is no regular father. Her father is the Gadol Hador, the generational leader of the Jewish people. Imagine the self-confidence it would take for a girl or young woman such as Miriam, the courage it would take for her to challenge such a personage. Miriam's willingness to push back on her father's authority is not incidental to the story. It's a major theme of the passage as a whole. Lest we miss the point, take a look at source number 4, which is not about Miriam, but which takes place in this same Talmudic stretch as these Miriam midrashim. Paro's daughter sees baby Moshe in the basket. It's obvious that this is an Israelite baby. The midrash fills an obvious gap. Bas Paro's attendants surely would have expressed surprise at the royal daughter's willingness to take in this child of Hebrews, this child who has been sentenced to death. So what do they say? Quote, "Our mistress, the way of the world is that a flesh and blood sovereign decrees a decree. Even if the whole world does not observe it, still the sovereign's children and household at least observe it. But you are transgressing your father's decree." The way of the world is to listen to parents, to trust in their wisdom. But Moshe would not have been born had Miriam lacked the will to stand up to her father. And he would not have survived had Paro's daughter not done the same. Lesson number 3. There is no redemption without the willingness to challenge communal structures of authority. And yet, despite Miriam's willingness to challenge authority, she is not a burn-it-down rabble-rouser. Eli Weinstein, a first-year student at UNC Asheville, recently highlighted something for me that I had never before paid attention to in this text. Even as Miriam chastises her own father, she does not lose respect for him. She calls him tzaddik, righteous one. And it's no mere flattery. Her logical argument depends on the premise that unlike that of wicked Paro, Amram's decision will come to be precisely because he is a tzaddik. This might be the most important lesson we learn from Miriam the sage. To bring redemption, we must have the courage to stand up to power, to ignore the power structures that might otherwise cow us into remaining silent. But standing up to power does not mean assuming the worst of those in power, or ignoring the good that they might do. Amram has made a terrible error, one so grievous that it threatens the very future of the Jewish people, and Miriam must say that. But he remains a tzaddik. Miriam has the courage to stand up to him without imagining him as a sold-out has-been, unworthy of her respect. What have we learned so far from Miriam about what it takes to bring geula, to bring redemption? Well, we need to be willing to speak hard truths to people who won't want to hear them. Even when our message is one of hope, the reality of redemption's curving path means steps backward will cause others to doubt us, and we might even come to doubt ourselves. That doubt, though, cannot lead to hopelessness. And finally, that the power to bring redemption requires the willingness to challenge authority, but without willy-nilly losing respect for those in authority. I want to consider one more midrash with you, this one not about Miriam, but still nested in the same context from which these Miriam midrashim come. And it's a story that many in my circles love. I imagine some of you, maybe many of you, have heard this midrash before. It is the story of the Nashim Tzidkanios, the righteous women of the Exodus generation. And this is source number 5 on your source sheets. Darash Rav Avira. Rav Avira gave over the following homily. Bischar Nashim Tzidkanios shayu ba'oso hador. In the merit of the righteous women who were in that generation, Nigalu Yisrael miMitzrayim. Israel was redeemed from Egypt. It was because of the righteous women that we got out at all. But what did these women do that was so meritorious? Bishash olchos lishov mayim, when they would go to draw water, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mizaben lehem dagim ketanim b'chadehem, v'shoavos mechze mayim umechze dagim. When they would go to draw water, the Blessed Holiness would make it such that they would get buckets full of half fish and half water. Ubaos v'shovtos shtei kederos achas shel chamen v'achas shel dagim. And they would put on the fire 2 pots, one of boiling water and one in which they were cooking fish. Umolichos etzel balehen lasadeh. And they would bring hot water and cooked fish to their husbands in the field. Umarchitzos osan v'sachos osan umachilos osan umashkos osan. They would bathe their husbands, and they would anoint their husbands with oil, and they would feed their husbands, and they would give their husbands what to drink. V'nizkakos lehen bein shefatayim. And they would have sexual relations with their husbands there in the fields between the mounds. The women of that generation had to seduce their husbands, which makes sense in light of what we've already seen tonight. Just as with Miriam's successful attempts to set her parents straight, this midrash responds to the troubling problem of how anyone could reproduce in a time of relentless oppression and genocide. In this midrashic response, Jewish men, like Amram in source number 3, have given up hope. And the women, like Miriam, have not. And they use the tools at their disposal to turn their partner's eyes toward redemption. What happens next? Kevan shemis abros baus levatehem. As soon as they conceived, they left the fields and went back home. V'chevan shemigia zman moldehen holchos v'yoldos besadeh tachas tapuach. As soon as as the time for them to give birth arrived, they would go and they would give birth underneath the apple trees. Shneamar tachas tapuach oroticha. As it says, underneath the apple tree I aroused you or awakened you. The women return home, but when it's time to give birth, they go back to the fields and deliver under the apple trees. This is actually one of the two reasons given in the Bavli for why we have charosas at the Seder. The better known reason, the one that is a little safer for Hebrew school, is as a remembrance of the mortar, zecher letit. Equally significant, however, is zecher letapuach. The charosas we eat at the Seder is meant to be a physical ingestion of the story we're now learning about women seducing their husbands and giving birth in the fields. Tell that at your Seder. I mean it. Tell it at your Seder. V'akadosh Baruch Hu sholeach mishmei marom mishiman kir umashpirosan. And the Blessed Holiness sent an angel from the heavens to take care of these children. Kechaya zo shemishaperes es havlad, like the midwife who takes care of newborns. Umelaket lehen shnei agulin, and gathers for them 2 loaves, echad shel shemen v'echad shel dvash, one of oil and one of honey. Shneamar vaynikeu dvash misela. God nursed them with honey from the rock. In response to the bravery of these women, God sends an angel to serve as midwife, cleaning the newborns and tending to their needs. After more miraculous protection, the midrashic tale ends at the splitting of the sea. Ukshenigla Kadosh Baruch Hu al hayam, when God revealed God's self at the sea, hem hikiru tchila, those children were the first to recognize God. Shneamar ze kelim yanvehu, as it says, this is my God, and I will glorify God. The rabbis always understand the word zeh as a pointing at someone. And so these children point at God and say, this is God. The children of miraculous births are the first to recognize God's presence at the sea, pointing and saying, as the Torah recounts, zeh keli v'yanvehu. Like Miriam, these women maintained hope. Their husbands are unwilling to father more children, but the women know that without continuing to live their lives, there is no redemptive future. Something else is at play here as well. Miriam had the courage to stand up to people in authority. The women in this midrash do something that feels similar, but which actually requires a different skill set. Hebrew University professor Yehoshua Levinson points out that the women in this midrash actively invert and subvert societal norms. Consider what precisely they do to bring geula. They leave their homes and go out to the fields. The fields, space that is, in the enslavement economy of ancient Egypt, men's space. So these women go out they leave the home, the woman's space, and they go into men's space. And what do they do when they get there? In a world where it's assumed that men initiate sexual encounters, these women take on that role, propositioning their husbands in the fields under the apple trees. It's precisely this inversion of gender norms, of what's expected, that brings about redemption. How does God respond? So, in the version of the midrash that you have in front of you, God sends an angel to play the role of midwife. But I kind of tricked you. Because in the best manuscript of this text, it is not an angel who comes down, but God, God's self. That is to say, God, a being typically, though to be sure not always depicted as male, God appears in the most stereotypically female role that exists, that of midwife. And even though all the other manuscripts and printed versions have the text as it appears before you on the source sheet, this more radical version is surely the correct one. First of all, you can see how a scribe would, scandalized by the idea of God being a midwife, change the text to make it about an angel rather than God. But even more compellingly is precisely this narrative point that God engages in midwifing these children that makes sense of the midrash's final scene. The children being the first to recognize God at the sea. They recognize and praise God, pointing at God, crying out, Zeh kelim yanvehu, because it was the same midwifing God who helped bring them into the world. The women of the generation of the Exodus are willing to challenge conventional norms, and God responds in kind, as if to make clear that this is exactly the sort of action a moment such as this requires. God responds to the righteous women's challenging of societal norms by challenging God's own conventional depiction as male. And this is what brings redemption. These are incredibly difficult models to live up to. Like Miriam, we have to have the courage to speak hard truths that people don't want to hear. And we have to be unwilling to give up hope when the facts on the ground seem to be pointing away from freedom. We have to be prepared to stand up to people who hold power over us, but without dehumanizing them or ignoring their wisdom and goodness. Like the women of the Exodus generation, we have to be prepared to act in ways that cut against what society tells us we're supposed to do. That is a very big ask. It's no surprise then that even most of the Israelites of the Exodus generation could not pull it off. In a midrash that my friend Rav Aryeh Bernstein showed me from the early midrashic work Mechilta, and again this one you don't have on your source sheets, in the Mechilta we learned that at most only 1 out of 5 Israelites actually made it out of Egypt, and maybe as few as 1 out of 500. The rest, the midrash tells us, died during the plague of darkness. Why? The Mechilta, which you don't have, is opaque on this point. But a later midrash, Exodus Rabbah, this is now source number 6, picks up the tradition and provides more detail. These people who did not make it out of Egypt, why did they not get out? Because they had Egyptian patrons, and they had their wealth and honor, and they did not want to go out. They were comfortable. They had it relatively good in the oppressive system of Egypt. Such comfort makes it incredibly difficult to have the courage needed to be a prophet or a sage or righteous like the women of the Exodus generation. Now, there's a convention, apparently sometimes referred to as Betteridge's Law of Headlines, that when a title takes the form of a question, the implied answer is always no. And I must admit that when I began working on this lecture, thinking about it as would you or would we have risen up, there was a big piece of me that was assuming the answer was in fact no. And to be clear, I include myself in this. I do, thank God, have a very comfortable life. And though I see and try to decry real suffering and oppression in this world, in the big scheme of things, I don't do so much to make actual change. Certainly not to the point of putting myself in any real danger or taking the kind of societal risks that Miriam and the women of her generation had to take. But I'm not so sure. While teaching the book of Amos to our yeshiva students last week, and sharing some of what I've spoken about tonight, how incredibly challenging and scary it is to be a prophet, what nearly superhuman courage it takes, I casually said something to the effect of course, most of us don't have that courage. And midway through the next sentence, I stopped myself because I remembered my father of blessed memory, a Holocaust survivor who spent the last years of the war hidden in the crawl space of a barn in Poland. I told my students about how my father refused to cut off his payas while in hiding, even as his family told him that, should they need to run, those payas would immediately reveal him to be a Jew and put his life in even more danger. They said, cut off your payas. And my father, 12, 13, 14 years old, refused to do it. My father's refusal to accept the oppression of the Nazis was not unique. People who, under ordinary circumstances, might not have been marked by their courage did extraordinary things. Now, please God, none of us in this room should ever be in that sort of situation. We should never have to find out if we have that kind of courage. And yet, the model of my father and of others like him reminds us that though for most of it it's hard to see, it's hard to feel, it's hard to tap into, we are capable of moments of prophetic courage, of the sagacity to see through the current moment to a brighter future, and of the righteousness to stand up to what society tells us we are supposed to do in order to do what we must do. Had we been a part of the Exodus generation, would we have risen up? I don't know. But I'm very grateful to the rabbis for showing us what it would take, what it does take, to be the kind of person who can. Thank you. we do have some time for questions before we move into singing. And I think Morty is going to facilitate this part.
Folks who have questions, please feel free to raise your hands.
While I've been listening about the women, and it was a patriarchal world and a patriarchal religion, even the Jewish. And so they rose up, and as a gay man, born into the Jewish world 68 years ago, that was like a really unacceptable thing to be. To speak at my son's bar mitzvah and call myself Imba, a mix of Ima and Abba, that was unacceptable to do. So my question is I know that my generation of homosexual human beings did not start 60 years ago. I wasn't the first. But somehow homosexuality in our Jewish religion, which I'm sure there were 5% of us, or 7 or 10, always. Why the women didn't stick up for us? Why we didn't stick up for us? And what is going on here that we're still fighting within? This isn't against the Nazis, and this isn't against the Egyptians. And I know there is a heart here, and my brother explained this place has a big heart, but it's still a struggle.
Yeah.
And I just don't understand what's going on within our own religion.
Thank you both for sharing that and for the question that goes along with it. And I think, there are two sides to that question, right? One, there's a paragraph that was supposed to go in here that didn't, simply because as I was writing, I forgot that I intended to write it, was that I don't think it's coincidental that it's Miriam, the sister, and the women who are the ones who maintain the faithfulness and the hope, and not Amram and not the men, right? Which is to say, I think there's something that happens when you are on the margins that encourages you, forces you to see things that other people don't see, that forces you to have courage and capabilities that aren't found in other folks. And what you're talking about, the experience of LGBTQ folks, both throughout history and in the last century, I mean, absolutely, right? There's something there. And the other piece you're asking is, well, then why do these women not stick up for those folks in that moment?
And I understand, because they're like...
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something here that this is always on a spectrum, right? It's never you are courageous or you aren't, but what are you able to see and what are you not able to see? And sometimes when you're dealing with your own oppression, it's really hard to see other folks' oppression as well. And that's horrible and tragic, and I also understand it, right? It really makes sense as well. Thank you so much for that question.
Other questions? Great, we have a question from Zoom. This is coming from Lewis. Oh, this is coming from someone else. What would you say, Rabbi Rosenberg, about the arc of Miriam and Aharon, Miriam, who later speaks ill of Moshe, and Aharon and his wife, and Aharon, who builds or enables the building of the Egel HaZahav?
Wow, that is a great question. I will say there's something interesting that happens in this stretch of 4 pages, two dapim, 4 amudim in Bavli Sota, which is that even though this stretch clearly is interested in Miriam's life, and it really explores almost every aspect of her life, it strikingly does not mention the moment when Miriam criticizes Moshe and gets punished for it, which I think makes clear that in this stretch, the Bavli is really interested in portraying Miriam as a hero, and wants to sort of skip over those parts of her story that are negative. So I think the Bavli is sort of bothered by the same thing that the questioner is asking, right? Which is, what about the fact that Miriam and Aaron, I'm going to defer for another night because I have to think more about Aaron, because that's, I've been spending a lot of time lately with Miriam. But the fact that both of them have these moments, I mean, look, all of them, right? Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe all have these moments of failure, these moments of failing. And maybe maybe these midrashim themselves speak to that, right? That point that Eli Weinstein, the freshman at UNC Asheville, made, which is that just because someone has a moment of failing does not mean we ignore all the good that they do, right? Amram remains a tzaddik despite the fact that he makes a decision that's worse than Paro. So I think probably that would be the sort of response out of these sources is, yeah, Miriam does err, and Aaron does err later in the story, but that doesn't mean we ignore them as models of righteousness and bringers of redemption.
Do you think there's an element of youth either in that arc or in these stories that Miriam is portrayed as the child in this moment? And what do you make of that?
Yeah, is the youthfulness, not just the gender, but also the youthfulness. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I actually spoke this past Shabbos about one of the offerings in the Parsha and how it sort of reflects the need for sort of the youth among us to sort of keep their spiritual fire alive and sort of use it to light on spiritual fire the rest of us who are maybe not as youthful as we once were. And there's something about that there, I think. And I would, what I said when I spoke on Shabbos is that it's not always chronological age, right? There are folks who, even in their 80s and 90s, have that fire, that passion to actually bring about redemption. And there are folks who in their teens and 20s are happy to sort of sit in the world as it is. So I think, Alex, you're right that by implication, you asked it as a question, but I think there's a clear implication there, that, Miriam also, it's not that she is a woman, but that she is young. But the women of the generation are not, by those standards, young necessarily, right? They're of childbearing age. I mean, who knows what that means in that time, right? But they're not necessarily, they're not culturally the youngest, right? They're the matriarchs, and they're the ones who are pushing it. So I think both and, right? There is an element of youthfulness, and the gender piece, I think, really is significant.
We'll take another question from Zoom. What is the context in which it is appropriate to stand up like Miriam, or perhaps when it is appropriate to surrender, as perhaps Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did? That's coming from Joel.
I bet I know which Joel that is. It's a hard question, so it must be from my chavrusa. So the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that whoever this Joel is referring to is with the destruction of Jerusalem, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, through various machinations, gets out and sort of flatters the general by saying you're going to become the emperor, and then the general does become the emperor, and now the new emperor is so pleased with him that he says, I'll give you whatever you want, and he says, someone's going to have to help me with the three things he wants. I want Yavne, right, a city to have our home base in, and I want the Nassi's family to come out, thank you, and who's the sick person he wants to heal, right? Rabbi Tzadok to be healed, right? Those are the three things. Did I get that right? Okay. And so it seems like a kind of surrender, right? Because basically the emperor is offering you anything. Why not ask for Jerusalem back? I would challenge the premise of the question, right? I actually don't think that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in that moment is actually surrendering. I think what he's realizing is that the times have changed. We're living in a different world. And to try to sort of recreate what we've had is not going to survive. And actually what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is doing is actually very similar to what the Nashim Tzidkanios, the righteous women in this midrash, do. He's using the tools available to him, right? Folks talk about this as the tools of the oppressed, which often involve deception and trickery, right? We could have described these women much less generously, right? Not as redeemers, but as tricksters. But often trickery is in fact the tools that those who are on the margins have available to them to try to bring redemption. And so I actually think Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is not surrendering. He's actually pushing back on Roman hegemony by saying, I'm going to find ways, the Romans are not around anymore, and we are. So I don't know who really surrendered in that story. That said, I think there is a broader question here of, there are times when you think you're pushing against authority for all the right reasons, but actually you're just serving your own narrow interests. I think that's actually the harder question to deal with. Things are always hard when it's a matter of actual values and subjectivity, right? At what point do I know that I'm really fighting for the just cause? That these midrashim don't give us an answer to. So come back to next year's Pre-Pesach lecture.
Two more questions? One more?
One more, yeah.
Yeah, what do you think about Pharaoh's daughter?
Oh, but I think you need the mic. I'll just repeat it. What was that?
Where does Pharaoh's daughter fit in?
Where does Pharaoh's daughter fit in? Can you just add one sentence to that question?
Why?
That's a sentence with a subject and a verb. Even a semicolon, maybe. What are you getting at?
Did she stand up?
Did she stand up?
Did she do something heroic?
Okay. did Pharaoh's daughter do something heroic? I absolutely think so. Without Pharaoh's daughter, if Pharaoh's daughter had said, oh, this is an Israelite child, my own father's decreed that this child should be murdered, well, then there would be no Moshe, there would be no Exodus. So I think absolutely Pharaoh's daughter is a hero of the story. In this stretch of Talmud, and for other reasons, Miriam is clearly the bigger hero, the bigger redemptive figure. But I absolutely think that Pharaoh's daughter, and again, she's actually one of those people sitting in maximal comfort. And yet, something causes her to see that there's something not right about this decree. Maybe she's not able to see the general wrongness of that decree. But she's able to see in this moment that this is a human child we're talking about, and I'm not going to let him get slaughtered. I think that's absolutely heroic. Sure, we can do one more.
One more. I just like this question. This is coming from Paula on Zoom. How do we support and nurture the new generation of Miriams that we so desperately need now? Sorry.
There is nothing harder than reaching the point in your life where you're like, oh, right, I'm the old guy they're fighting against now. Which has, been a little bit of my experience in recent years. And I think the first thing is when you feel that defensiveness and that rigidity start to come in, which I've been feeling more and more, to notice that and say, am I feeling this rigidity, this defensiveness, because folks are pushing in ways that are actually unhelpful, right? In some ways goes back to 2 questions ago, right? Am I feeling this because there's actually pushing for something that's actually unhelpful? And maybe that's the case. And maybe it's the case that I pushed really hard to get our people to a certain point, and now I'm feeling defensive because I didn't think to get us farther, right? There's something that happens when people really push for something. There are feminist Jewish heroes who got us closer to what Hadar is, but they weren't able to get us to where Hadar is. And sometimes I wonder if maybe they push back on Hadar, not because they really are opposed to us, but because they feel some kind of defensiveness that they didn't see that we could actually push the flag farther down the field. And I suspect that will be true for me also, that there will be things that my colleagues and I really push to bring into the world. In some ways, your question about pushing for gender equality, but also for LGBT rights, right? Like, there are some folks who feel like, yeah, we've gone this far, and now. So I think taking stock of that feeling of like, am I feeling defensiveness because I actually fundamentally and substantively disagree with these folks who are raising new concerns, which sometimes will be the case, or because they're actually showing me that I didn't quite go as far as I could have. I think that's the first step, right? I didn't actually get to nurturing them, but I think not quashing them is the sort of first step in thinking about that. At this point, I would love to call upon my dear colleague, Rav Deborah Sachs-Mintz. We're going to learn a niggin that I wrote inspired by the texts from tonight's learning. So this is the first source on your source sheets. It's the unnumbered one, the Geula Arichta niggin. Geula Arichta meaning long redemption. Recognizing that the path from freedom to, from enslavement to freedom can take a long way.
I just want to say that coming back to the question around the sort of tools of rising up in oppression, song is certainly one of our most fundamental tools in rising up, but in also getting ourselves closer to the day that we have not yet seen. And this beautiful song that Rav Michael has written really takes us on the journey from the beginning of seeing that kernel of prophecy to dropping in where it's begun to manifest. So we'll learn it a bit together and sing it here in this space. And I invite you to join and sing if you're tuning in on Zoom. And then we'll reset downstairs in our singing circle, beginning again with the same nigun. So you can find it on the front. If you'll just repeat after me, we'll learn it together. Let's try that much together. Hi, da, da, da. Hi, da, 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 da. One more time. Let's try that with that text. Listen and repeat. ותצצב אחותו מרחוק. ותצצב אחותו מרחוק. לדיה מה יעשה לו. לדיה מה יעשה לו. Let's try that together. ותצצב אחותו מרחוק. לדיה מה יעשה לו. One more time. ותצצב אחותו מרחוק. לדיה מה יעשה לו. So the second time, because we want to get to our B section, we go di-di-da ba 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 wo. Try that. Di-di-da ba 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 wo. One more time. Di-di-da da 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 da. That's going to take us to the real heart opener, the B section of every nigun we call the heart opener. It's what our hearts crack open, and we get to that. We climb a little higher on the ladder. One more time. So we're going to try the whole second section, but we finish. Ma yaseh lo. Try that. Ma yaseh lo. Great from the beginning. Vatetatzav achoto merachok. Ledeya ma yaseh lo. Vatetatzav achoto merachok. Ledeya ma yaseh lo. Next part. Zeili ve'yan ve'yu. Zeili ve'yan ve'yu. Zeili. Zeili ve'yan ve'yu. Ve'yan ve'yu. From Zeli. Zeli ve'yan ve'yu. Zeli ve'yan. One more time. Zeli ve'yan ve'yu. Zeli ve'yan ve'yu. From the beginning.